A poor child shares their lunch with a stranger. Days later, the family receives a phone call that leaves them in disbelief. But before that, consider subscribing to the channel so we can keep sharing amazing stories. In a small village in the United States, the Thompson family lived a modest life. Sarah and John, a hard-working couple, had an 8-year-old son named Tommy. Their days were often marked by struggle, as John's sporadic work brought in just enough to cover the bare necessities. The small house they lived in was old but well kept, with Sarah doing her best to make it a home despite their limited means. Tommy, though young, was acutely aware of their circumstances. He watched as his parents worked tirelessly, and he noticed the weight of their worries, especially during those cold winter nights when the wind would seep through the cracks in the walls. Yet, despite the challenges, Tommy had a light in him, a kindness and generosity that seemed boundless, even though he had so little to give. He was a quiet, observant child, often helping his mother with chores or keeping his father company when he returned home exhausted from work. Tommy had a small lunch that Sarah packed for him every day, a simple sandwich made with the last of their bread and whatever filling they could afford. It wasn't much, but to Tommy, it was a reminder of his mother's love and care. The village, while small, was close-knit, and everyone knew of the Thompson family's struggles. Neighbors would sometimes offer help, but pride and the desire to manage on their own often kept Sarah and John from accepting more than they needed. They were grateful for what they had and tried to teach Tommy the value of humility and gratitude. Tommy, however, had a heart that went beyond just gratitude. He was deeply empathetic. He didn't see their life as one of deprivation, but rather as one where small acts of kindness could make a world of difference. He often thought about how he could help others, even in the smallest ways, though he wasn't sure how or when those opportunities might arise. As Tommy walked home from school one cold winter afternoon, his breath visible in the frosty air, he noticed a man sitting on the sidewalk. The man was huddled in a thin coat, shivering uncontrollably, with his arms wrapped tightly around his chest, as if trying to hold on to what little warmth he had left. His face was gaunt, and there was a deep sadness in his eyes that Tommy couldn't ignore. Tommy hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the sandwich in his backpack. It was the only food he had for the rest of the day, and he knew how much his mother had sacrificed to make sure he didn't go hungry. But as he looked at the man, Tommy felt a tug in his heart, a sense of responsibility almost, that this was the moment he had been waiting for, a chance to help someone who needed it more than he did. With a determined step, Tommy approached the man. He pulled the sandwich from his backpack, the bread slightly squished from being carried around all day. Without a word, Tommy held it out to the man, whose eyes widened in surprise. The man stared at the sandwich for a moment, as if unsure whether it was really meant for him. Tommy's hand trembled slightly in the cold, but his resolve was firm. The man finally took the sandwich from Tommy's small hand, his fingers brushing against Tommy's in a brief moment of connection. The man's hands were rough and cold, a stark contrast to Tommy's warm, youthful skin. Tommy gave him a small, encouraging nod, silently urging him to eat. The man took the sandwich from Tommy's hand, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He hadn't expected such kindness, especially from a child. For a moment, he was speechless, overwhelmed by the simple yet profound act of generosity. He looked at Tommy, a small smile breaking through the lines of weariness on his face. It wasn't just the sandwich, it was the fact that someone had noticed him, someone cared enough to give him what little they had. With a voice that trembled slightly, the man asked, "What's your name, son?" His words were soft, almost hesitant, as if he feared breaking the spell of the moment. "Tommy," the boy replied simply, his innocent eyes meeting the man's gaze with a warmth that went beyond his years. Tommy didn't fully understand the depth of what he had done, but he felt good knowing he had helped someone in need. The man nodded, his smile growing a bit wider, despite the tears that now threatened to spill over. "I won't forget this, Tommy. I promise you that." His voice carried a weight that Tommy couldn't quite grasp, but he smiled back anyway, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. Tommy turned to leave, his heart light as he began walking away, his small figure gradually disappearing down the cold, empty street. The man watched him go, holding the sandwich close to his chest as if it were something precious, something far more valuable than just food. He stood there for a long time, lost in thought, before finally taking a bite. Days passed, and life in the Thompson household continued its usual rhythm of struggle. The weight of financial burdens grew heavier with each passing day. Sarah and John found themselves increasingly anxious, their conversations often revolving around how to make ends meet. Bills piled up on the small wooden table in their living room, each one a reminder of the mounting pressures they faced. John took on extra work wherever he could find it, but the pay was meager and unreliable. He came home late most nights, his hands rough and his spirit worn down from the physical labor. Sarah, too, did what she could, sometimes taking in sewing jobs from neighbors or selling baked goods to bring in a little extra money, but it never seemed to be enough. Tommy, unaware of the full extent of his parents' worries, continued to go to school and help around the house. His small act of kindness with the sandwich had been quickly overshadowed by the relentless demands of daily survival. To Sarah and John, it was just a sweet gesture, lost in the sea of larger, more pressing concerns. They didn't speak much about their struggles in front of Tommy, wanting to protect him from the harsh realities they faced. But the tension in the air was palpable, and even Tommy could sense that things were difficult. He saw the worry lines deepening on his mother's face, the tired look in his father's eyes, and he knew, in his own way, that life was hard for them all. The winter days dragged on, cold and unforgiving. The Thompson family bundled up in whatever layers they had to keep warm, the drafty windows offering little protection against the biting wind. Sarah tried to keep the house cheerful, but there was an undercurrent of despair that even she couldn't fully mask. Weeks later, on a particularly cold afternoon, the Thompson family huddled together in their small living room. The winter wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the warmth inside the house felt more precious than ever. John sat at the table, a stack of bills in front of him, his brow furrowed as he tried to figure out how they would manage to pay the next electricity bill. Sarah stood nearby, her arms crossed tightly against her chest, the weight of worry pulling her shoulders down. Tommy played quietly on the floor, sensing the tension but not fully understanding it. The air in the room was thick with unspoken fears. They had been scraping by for months, but now, with the temperatures dropping and the bills piling up, the reality of their situation was becoming harder to ignore. The prospect of losing heat in the dead of winter was terrifying, and John and Sarah exchanged glances, each searching for some reassurance in the other's eyes, though neither could find it. Suddenly, the shrill ring of the telephone cut through the heavy silence, startling them all. It was a rare occurrence for their phone to ring, especially in the middle of the day. Sarah hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding, before she walked over to the phone. She picked up the receiver, her hand trembling slightly, and brought it to her ear. "Hello?" she answered, her voice carrying a mix of curiosity and unease. She had no idea who could be calling or what news they might bring, but something about the unexpected nature of the call filled her with apprehension. The line crackled for a moment, and then a voice on the other end spoke, sending a shiver down her spine. The voice on the other end of the line was calm and polite, carrying a professional tone that immediately caught Sarah's attention. "Good afternoon," the voice began. "Am I speaking with Mrs. Thompson, Tommy Thompson's mother?" "Michael Collins, a prominent businessman here in the city. He asked me to reach out to you personally." A flurry of thoughts swirled in her mind, none of them making any sense. She glanced over at John, who was watching her intently, his eyes filled with silent questions. "Mr. Collins recently had an encounter with your son, Tommy," Emily explained. "It left a deep impression on him, and he's asked me to contact you regarding something important." Sarah could hear the sincerity in Emily's voice, but it did little to ease her anxiety. She swallowed hard, trying to find her voice. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand," Sarah stammered. "What does Mr. Collins want with Tommy? What is this about?" Emily took a deep breath, sensing Sarah's confusion and concern. Her voice softened as she began to explain. "A few weeks ago, Mr. Collins had a chance encounter with your son, Tommy. He was deeply moved by a simple act of kindness that Tommy extended to him during a particularly difficult time. It's not often that someone in Mr. Collins's position experiences such genuine compassion, especially from someone so young." She listened intently, the pieces of the puzzle slowly coming together, yet still not forming a complete picture. "Mr. Collins has been thinking about that moment ever since," Emily continued. "It's rare that something so small can have such a profound impact. But Tommy's gesture was one of those rare moments. It reminded Mr. Collins of the importance of generosity and the incredible power of a kind heart, even in the face of adversity." She could hardly believe that this man, this influential businessman, had been affected so strongly by something her little boy had done. "Mr. Collins has been thinking of how he could possibly repay Tommy for what he did," Emily added. "He believes that such kindness should not go unnoticed or unrewarded, and he's determined to express his gratitude in a meaningful way." Sarah listened in stunned silence as Emily continued to explain the extent of Mr. Collins' gratitude. "Mr. Collins has given this a lot of thought," Emily said, her voice steady but with a hint of warmth that suggested she understood how overwhelming this must be for Sarah. "He feels strongly that your family should not have to worry about financial burdens, especially given the kindness your son has shown. He wanted to take care of all the family's immediate expenses, including the bills that had been piling up on the Thompsons' kitchen table. But that wasn't all. Mr. Collins was also prepared to provide ongoing support to ensure that Sarah, John, and Tommy would no longer have to live in constant fear of what tomorrow might bring. He wanted to make sure that their lives were not just free of financial stress, but that they could also experience a level of comfort and security they had never known before. He understands that this might be a lot to take in," Emily continued, her tone gentle, "but he wants you to know that this offer comes from a place of genuine appreciation. Mr. Collins believes that the world could use more people like Tommy, and he wants to do everything he can to ensure that your son grows up knowing that his kindness made a real difference." The idea that someone like Michael Collins, a man of such wealth and influence, would be so moved by a simple act of sharing a sandwich, it was almost too much to believe. And yet, here was this woman, speaking with such sincerity, laying out a future that Sarah had never dared to imagine. Sarah's hands shook as she lowered the phone slightly, her mind reeling from the conversation she'd just had. She looked at John, who had been listening to her side of the conversation with growing concern. "John," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "You won't believe this. What is it, Sarah? What did they say?" His voice was calm, but Sarah could see the anxiety in his eyes. She struggled to find the right words, still trying to wrap her mind around the incredible offer that had just been made. It's about Tommy," she started, her voice trembling. "The man on the phone, he's an assistant to a businessman named Michael Collins. He wants to help us, John. He wants to pay our bills, take care of everything." "How does he even know us?" His questions came quickly, his mind unable to grasp the enormity of what Sarah was telling him. Sarah explained as best as she could, recounting the story Emily had shared about Tommy's small act of kindness and how it had touched Michael Collins so deeply. She could see the disbelief in John's eyes, mirroring her own feelings of shock and confusion. Emily's voice interrupted her thoughts as she returned to the phone. "Mrs. Thompson, Mr. Collins would like to meet your family in person, if that's something you're comfortable with. He feels it's important to express his gratitude face to face." But there was something in the way Emily spoke, a sincerity that made Sarah feel that this was not just about charity, but about genuine human connection. After a moment of silent communication with John, Sarah brought the phone back to her ear. "Yes," she said softly, "we'd like that." A few days later, the Thompson family found themselves anxiously awaiting the arrival of Michael Collins. The small house had been tidied up as best as possible, though there was no hiding the modesty of their home. The air was thick with a mix of anticipation and nerves, each of them wondering what this meeting would bring. When the knock finally came at the door, Sarah took a deep breath and exchanged a glance with John before she opened it. Standing on their doorstep was Michael Collins, a man of calm demeanor with a gentle smile. He was dressed simply, but with an air of quiet confidence that immediately put them at ease. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," he greeted them warmly, extending his hand to both of them. His handshake was firm but not overpowering, the kind that conveyed respect and sincerity. As he stepped inside, his eyes swept over the home, taking in the simple surroundings with a look of quiet understanding. Tommy, standing close to his mother, watched the man intently. Collins crouched down to Tommy's level, smiling gently. "You must be Tommy," he said softly. "It's a pleasure to meet you." Collins that made him feel safe, like he was someone who understood more than he let on. As they all sat down together, Collins began to speak, his voice calm and reflective. "I want to thank you, Tommy," he began, his eyes meeting the boys. "What you did for me that day, it reminded me that there is still goodness in this world. that a simple act of kindness can make a difference, even in the smallest of ways. I've seen and experienced a lot in my life, Collins continued, but your son's generosity touched me deeply. It made me realize that I needed to do more, to give back in ways that truly matter. As the conversation deepened, Michael Collins shifted from expressing his gratitude to sharing something more personal. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze softening as he looked at the family before him. "I don't often talk about my past," he began, his voice carrying a weight of memories long buried. "But seeing the kindness in Tommy reminded me of where I came from and the struggles I once faced. Raised in a poor neighborhood, Collins knew what it was like to go without, to feel the sting of hunger and the cold bite of winter with inadequate shelter. His family had often struggled to make ends meet, much like the Thompsons, and there were days when he wasn't sure if they would have food on the table. But there were people who helped us along the way," he said, his eyes meeting Sarah's. "People who saw the potential in us, who believed that with a little support, we could rise above our circumstances. That's what kept me going. And when I saw Tommy's act of kindness, it brought all those memories rushing back. It reminded me that I've been given opportunities that others haven't, and that it's my responsibility to give back. I want to make sure that you and your family have the tools and support you need to build a better future. That means guiding you through the challenges ahead, helping you find ways to achieve stability and prosperity, so that Tommy can grow up knowing that his kindness has had a lasting impact, not just on me, but on his own family." It was clear that Collins saw this not just as an act of charity, but as a way to honor the boy who had reminded him of the importance of generosity and the potential it has to change lives. The days and weeks that followed Michael Collins's visit brought profound changes to the Thompson family. The financial burden that had weighed so heavily on Sarah and John was lifted as Collins followed through on his promises. The bills that had piled up on their small wooden table were paid. The fear of losing their home or enduring another freezing winter without adequate heating dissipated like a bad dream. With Collins' guidance and resources, John found stable work, and Sarah was able to focus on making their home a place of warmth and security. For the first time in as long as they could remember, the Thompsons felt hope for the future. Their home, once filled with the anxiety of constant struggle, now brimmed with the possibility of new beginnings. Tommy, still unaware of the full extent of what had happened, noticed the changes too. His parents smiled more often, and there was a lightness in their steps that hadn't been there before. The house was warmer, both literally and figuratively, and the atmosphere had shifted from one of quiet desperation to one of peace and contentment. Despite all these changes, Tommy remained the same kind-hearted boy he had always been. He didn't fully understand the significance of his gesture, nor did he realize the ripple effect it had created. But he could see the happiness in his parents' faces and the newfound sense of security in their lives. He knew, in his own simple way, that something he had done had made a difference, and that knowledge filled him with a quiet pride. Tommy continued to share what little he had with others, whether it was a snack with a classmate or a kind word to someone who needed it. He understood on a deep, instinctual level that the world could be a better place if everyone acted with the same generosity he had shown that cold winter day. And though he never sought recognition, the impact of his actions had already started to shape not only his life, but the lives of those around him.